BlackFacts.com presents BlackFacts Educational Series. The Great Migration. Looking for a Better Life. The Great Migration, sometimes known as the Great Northward Migration or the Black Migration, was the movement of 6 million African Americans out of the rural southern United States to the urban Northeast, Midwest, and West that occurred between 1916 and 1970. The historic change brought by the migration was amplified because the migrants, for the most part, moved to the then largest cities in the United States. These big cities had a central cultural, social, political, and economic influence over the United States. There, African Americans established influential communities of their own. Causes. The primary factors for migration among Southern African Americans were segregation, an increase in the spread of racist ideology, widespread lynching, and lack of social and economic opportunities in the South. There were also factors that pulled migrants to the North, such as labor shortages in northern factories brought about by World War I, resulting in thousands of jobs in steel mills, railroads, and the automobile industry. The pull of jobs in the North was strengthened by the efforts of labor agents sent by northern businessmen to recruit Southern workers. Another factor was the decline of European immigrants during World War I, which caused northern factories to feel the impact of a low supply of workers. This created a wartime opportunity in the North for African Americans. First Great Migration, 1910 to 1940. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, less than 8% of the African American population lived in the northeastern or midwestern United States. This began to change over the next decade. By 1880, migration was underway to Kansas. In 1900, about 90% of blacks still lived in southern states. With the migration of African Americans northward and the mixing of white and black workers in factories, the tension was building, largely driven by white workers. The American Federation of Labor advocated the separation between white and African Americans in the workplace. There were nonviolent protests, such as walkouts in protest of having African Americans and white working together. As tension was building due to advocating for segregation in the workplace, violence soon erupted in 1917. The East St. Louis, Illinois riot had among 40 to 200 African Americans killed. The NAACP responded to the violence with a march known as the Silent March. Over 10,000 African Americans, men and women, demonstrated in Harlem, New York. Between 1919 and 1940, violence continued happening, affecting cities as Washington, D.C., Chicago, Omaha, Knoxville, Tennessee, and Elaine in Arkansas, and a small rural town 70 miles southwest of Memphis. The violence in these major cities, starting in 1919 with the called Red Summer, prefaced the soon-to-follow Harlem Renaissance, an African-American cultural revolution, in the 1920s. Second Great Migration, 1940–1970. 1930s Great Depression resulted in reduced migration because of decreased opportunities. With the defense build-up for World War II and the post-war economic prosperity, migration was revived. Larger numbers of blacks left the South through the 1960s. This wave of migration often resulted in overcrowding of urban areas due to exclusionary housing policies. There were clear migratory patterns that linked particular states and cities in the South to corresponding destinations in the North and West. Almost half of those who migrated from Mississippi during the First Great Migration, for example, ended up in Chicago, while those from Virginia tended to move to Philadelphia. These patterns were related to geography, with the closest cities attracting the most migrants. Los Angeles and San Francisco received a disproportionate number of migrants from Texas and Louisiana. When multiple destinations were equidistant, chain migration played a larger role, with migrants following the path set by those before them. Cultural changes. After moving from the racist pressures of the South to the northern states, African Americans were inspired to different kinds of creativity. The Great Migration resulted in the Harlem Renaissance, which was also fueled by immigrants from the Caribbean. According to Isabel Wilkerson, 6 million black Southerners moved from the Jim Crow's terror to an uncertain existence in the North and Midwest. The struggle of African American migrants to adapt to northern cities was the subject of Jacob Lawrence's Migration series of paintings, created when he was a young man in New York. The Great Migration had effects on music as well as other cultural subjects. Many blues singers migrated from the Mississippi Delta to Chicago to escape racial discrimination. Effects. The Great Migration drained off much of the rural black population of the South, and for a time, froze or reduced African American population growth in parts of the region. In a number of states, there were decades of black population decline, especially across the Deep South, Black Belt, where cotton had been king. The migration changed the demographics of the South. In 1910, African Americans constituted the majority of the population of South Carolina and Mississippi. By 1970, only in Mississippi did the African American population constitute more than 30% of the state's total. The disappearance of the Black Belt was one of the striking effects of the Great Migration. James Gregory. Migrants encountered significant forms of discrimination. The African American migrants were often resented by the urban European American working class, many of whom were recent immigrants themselves. Fearing their ability to negotiate rates of pay or secure employment, the ethnic whites felt threatened by the influx of new labor competition. In cities such as Newark, New York, and Chicago, African Americans became increasingly integrated into society. As they lived and worked more closely with European Americans, the divide became increasingly indefinite. This period marked the transition for many African Americans from lifestyles as rural farmers to urban industrial workers. After the political and civil gains of the civil rights movement, in the 70s, migration began to increase again. It moved in a different direction, as blacks traveled to new regions of the South for economic opportunity. Narrated by Timbuktu. To learn more about Black history, visit www.blackfacts.com.